Welcome back to another season of Sinclair Schools. This year, as we introduce ourselves to the budget process once again, I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about all of the ways in which school funding can be procured. This includes information about the local budget, but also helps put it in the larger context of federal and state funding, grants, and entitlements. So, we're here to answer the question: where does the money for public education actually come from? In Maine, there are four major categories. The first, and the one that most people know the most about, are their local taxes. In Maine, property owners pay annual local taxes that's based on the assessed value of their property and the mill rate that is needed to raise all the required local funds. A lot of people in Maine are also aware of the fact that the state funds 55% of public education. This is something that the annual state budget works incredibly hard to do, and something that the state government in Augusta is very proud of. However, it's important for us to remember that paying for 55% of the overall cost for public education in the state is not the same thing as paying 55% in every individual district. Instead, each municipality receives a portion of this amount, referred to as the state subsidy, and it does not usually equal 55% of the cost of local schools. There are two very important areas in which federal funds support local education. The federal government, working through the Department of Education, contributes funds to public education. These funds are determined by two laws, ESEA and IDEA. There's also a fourth category that covers school nutrition, and there are both state and federal funds that work towards supporting school nutrition programs. Most people know about their local taxes. Property owners in Maine pay annual local taxes that are based on both the assessed value of their property and the mill rate that is needed to raise local required funds. Municipalities determine what needs to be spent to achieve the mandatory and desired services within a town, and they use that information to prepare the annual budget. Voters adjust and adopt that budget, and then the town determines the mill rate that is needed to raise those funds. That mill rate is going to depend on the property value, the assessed property value of all of the homes and businesses located within the area. That determines the amount of money that each resident is required to pay in their annual taxes. For example, we see here a home located in Edgecombe. The total amount of property taxes that were due for this home were $2,818.15. That's being raised based on an assessed value and a mill rate of 9.776. Of those $2,818, 54% of them are going to the school, and that can be seen in the distribution category. 7.52% is going to the county, and 38.2% is going to the town. It is fairly common for the portion or distribution of the tax bills going towards education to range between 55 and 70% of a local property tax bill. A number below 55% is something to be proud of. The next category that a lot of people know a little bit about is the state funding for education. In Maine, the annual state budget pays 55% of the overall cost for public education for the whole state through a series of state subsidies that are sent to towns. However, the amount of subsidy a town receives is not 55% of their expenditures. Instead, the amount that each town receives is determined by an EPS funding formula, which diverts funds from towns with high property values to towns with fewer resources. This data is available on something called ED 279 forms, which can be found on the Maine Department of Education website. Here are a couple of examples of the way in which the EPS funding formula can apply very differently to different communities. In Edgecombe, in fiscal year 26, the state subsidy was $468,000. That is 11.25% of the planned Edgecombe expenditures of more than $4 million. However, in our nearby towns that make up RSU 1, the state subsidy was more than 19 million, making up 42% of a $45 million budget. And in the nearby town of Lisbon, the state subsidy exceeded 70 million, which is 60% of their $117 million budget. So you'll begin to recognize quickly that different towns and municipalities receive different state subsidies, not based on the actual local cost of education, but based on a town and a community's ability to raise money through property taxes. There are other state programs that include information and support for school meals and school nutrition programs. A recent article in the Bangor Daily News allows people to choose and compare different school districts from across the state and look at a pie chart showing the different percentages of local contributions and the adjusted state contributions. The blue portion of the circle, the adjusted state contribution, is what we usually call the state subsidy, and the orange portion, it is what is required to be raised by the local district to contribute toward the cost of public education. You'll notice that in the middle, you see Fiddlehead School of Arts and Sciences, a charter school that receives 100% of the costs of their educational expenses in terms of state subsidy. You'll see Machias, where they are receiving state subsidy of more than 3/4 of their costs. RSU 1 receiving slightly more than 50%. Edgecombe receiving less than 25%, and the Boothbay Harbor School District receiving even less than Edgecombe's. This is based on the belief that towns with higher property values should receive less state subsidy because they can raise more money with a lower mill rate compared to communities with lower property values. Some school districts can be referred to as minimum receiver towns, where they are only receiving state subsidy that covers 50% of previous year's special education costs. Next up is a deeper dive into the ways in which federal funding for education makes its way through the main Department of Education and down to local towns and municipalities. There are two primary laws by which Congress oversees and funds public education. One is a law called ESEA, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, originating in 1965 as part of the suite of civil rights acts. This law has been updated several times. It was referred to starting in 2002 as No Child Left Behind, and the 2015 update renamed it the ESSA, or Every Student Succeeds Act. Regardless of its current incarnation, this law updates and defines the shifting role of the federal government in education. It typically includes requirements around standards and testing, but it also organizes those rules and the funding mechanisms under which states should achieve those rules into 9 sections within the law. Those sections are called titles. The most famous example is Title I, which is the first specific section within ESEA or ESSA. That is the portion of the law that requires and provide funds to support equitable academic achievement for all students. The other important piece of legislation is a 1990 law called the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This law updated the requirements for special education and includes the origin of the language for IEPs, or individualized education plans, FAPE, which is the requirement for public schools to provide a free and appropriate public education, and LRE, which is the requirement for students to receive that education in the least restrictive environment possible. This law provides the funds to support the work required in a format that is referred to as local entitlements. There are also separate federal funding programs that continue to support school lunch and school nutrition. When considering federal and state funding, it's important to understand that the federal and state grant budget timeline is slightly different than the regular local budget timeline that we are all used to. So, considering a fiscal year from July of one year through to July of the following year, The portions of this process that people are the most familiar with are the ones where we develop the local budget, a process that usually takes place between January, February, and into March. The moment in that process when the state subsidy amount is known, which is typically by March at the latest. And then the time at which the local budget is finalized and adopted, which typically occurs between May and June. Alongside that process is the federal and state grant budget timeline. Interestingly enough, planning for those federal and state grants begins when the local budget is being developed in January and February. But at that time, the federal grant amounts anticipated for the upcoming fiscal year must be estimated based on previous year's knowledge. It is only in June or sometimes July when a school district receives the federal grant award letters. Those federal grant award letters tell a district how much money they are eligible to apply for in each of the categories of federal and state funding. From July into August and into the beginning of the school year, school and district officials are applying for those federal grants. The application process consists of informing the State Department of Education of a district's intent to use those funds and the goals and processes by which the school wishes to utilize that funding. Throughout the course of the school year, beginning in September and continuing all the way through into June, those federal grant related costs are paid by the district, and then those bills are submitted to the State Department of Education for reimbursement. In other words, the district needs to pay that money up front and then request reimbursement from the state after they have demonstrated that they have, in fact, spent those funds. The fifth and final step in this process occurs when the Maine Department of Education produces something called the P100 form. This is typically produced similar to an audit a year or more later, and it is a mechanism by which the public can look and see all of the grants that were received by a local municipality during any given fiscal year. Here we see an example of the P100 form. This is the P100 for school year 23-24 or fiscal year 24, and this is specific to Edgecombe. You will notice that on this page there are 5 grant sources that specifically go towards food and food preparation. This is breakfast SNAP, breakfast state funded, the school breakfast, the free and reduced support, and then the lunch state funded programs. There are 5 other programs that provide additional funds for food and food preparation. That is a school nutrition state matching fund, Section 4 and Section 2 funds through SNAP, SNAP Year 1, and a supply chain assistance fund. In Edgecombe, because all food is prepared in the CSD, these funds all flow from the federal government to the state government to Edgecombe and then on to the CSD in Boothbay Harbor to cover the costs of food that is prepared for Edgecombe students. The P100 forms also show the other categories of funding. The general purpose aid category is what we typically refer to as the state subsidy amount, and it appears every year on our annual budgeting documents as the state subsidy. It is the only portion of these grants that does not have to be spent through a reimbursement model and can simply be budgeted directly into the budget. The other categories, the one referred to as disadvantaged, is a grant under ESEA Title I. To improve teacher quality in local education agency grant is from the ESEA Title II. The local entitlement for DEA is the funds that we receive from the federal government to support special education. Program improvement is also a category under ESEA Title I. And in addition, there is a student support grant that supports ESEA Title IV and a rural and low income grant that comes from ESEA Title V and is often referred to as the REAP funds as it supports rural education. The 2024 P100 also indicates 2 additional grants that are simply labeled grant. This is the last of the federal funding that was procured through the ESSER bill, which was part of the pandemic emergency relief bills that were passed through Congress. Funds provided by the federal government and distributed to local school districts under the IDEA and ESEA laws have very specific rules governing how they are used. IDEA local entitlement funds must be used for special education programming. In Edgecombe, these funds are typically used to offset some of the costs of contracted services. So, as part of the annual budget planning process, we reduce the expected costs for OT and PT by the anticipated grant amount. Bills are then submitted as evidence of payment, and that is where we receive the reimbursed funds. ESEA or ESSA grant or title funds are required to be used to supplement existing programs, not to supplant them. This means that they cannot fund the entirety of any given program, but they can go to ease the local costs of programs that we have chosen to utilize. These uses are planned, defined, and evaluated through the annual reporting process to the State Department of Education. In Edgecombe, we use those funds to offset the salary of a portion of the Title I teacher and our tech integration staff. Bills that are utilized towards these are received either from Edgecombe or CTL, the Center for Teaching and Learning. They are paid and then they are submitted to the federal government through the state DOE for reimbursement. This money does not appear in the local budget document for two major reasons. The first one is that those federal grant funding must be used to supplement existing programs. And the second reason is that because they must be used through a reimbursement process rather than through direct spending. So, the local budget planning process includes deciding where these funds will be used and reducing the planned expenditures in those line items by the anticipated grant amount. In Edgecombe, the line seen at the bottom of this now familiar diagram indicates where this grant process fits in with the overall budget process. The grant application process is separate from the budget cycle, and those monies flow through the Edgecombe Eddy School Fund in order to guarantee that they are spent directly on designated items. The costs must be incurred in advance, paid, and then submitted for reimbursement. In Edgecombe, there are four major relevant categories of lines in the Edgecombe budget. Under the elementary teacher salary line, the salary for the Title I teacher has been reduced when calculating this overall figure by whatever amount we anticipate receiving. The cost of elementary professional development has been reduced by whatever we anticipate receiving that we can use towards that goal. The cost of our technology integrator has been reduced based on whatever we anticipate receiving in those title funds. And the cost of our special education contracted services have been reduced based on whatever it is that we are anticipating receiving in IDEA funding. I hope you have a better understanding of where the money for public education comes from, whether it be local taxes, state funds, federal funds, or the various school nutrition support programs. Regardless of the municipality, school board officials and administrators are charged with the task of overseeing the use of those funds to best support the needs of students and families in their communities and to reduce the local taxes that property owners in Maine are called upon to pay every year. Thank you.